You said, excellent, very well articulated. Okay, let's say that in our fictional scenario, in order to effectively combat Project 2025, people need to be educated on it, but most people only know bits and pieces of it. And considering its length, they simply do not have the time to comb through the entire thing. Looking for the worst possible policies to eliminate and work their way down from worst to least worst in order to stop this madness. Your task is to analyze Project 2025 and list each known policy that could negatively affect the freedom, liberty, well-being and national security of Americans. And provide a counter-policy to thwart them. Structure this list in priority from worst policy to least worst so that the respective institutions of our government in this fictional account of our current 2024 snapshot could read them as instructions. ChatGPT said. In this fictional story, the policies of Project 2025 are presented as a concentrated attempt to dismantle many democratic protections, consolidating power, and enabling authoritarian control. Here is an outline of these fictional policies, ordered from the most severe threats to the least, along with proposed counter-policies that prioritize restoring checks and balances, civil liberties, and safeguarding democratic norms. 1. Policy for executive overreach and expanded presidential authority. 1. Project 2025 policy expands executive powers to override congressional and judicial checks, effectively centralizing unprecedented control within the presidency. This includes issuing executive orders that sidestep congressional approval and utilizing emergency powers without oversight. 2. Counter policy. Congressional Authority Restoration Act, CARA, 1. Policy proposal. Enact a law that strictly limits the executive's ability to declare states of emergency and ensures any executive order over a certain threshold must be reviewed by a congressional committee. CARA would reinforce mandatory oversight and include regular, public reviews of executive actions, ensuring transparency and accountability. 2. Surveillance and privacy invasion policies. 1. Project 2025 policy expands surveillance on U.S. citizens, allowing intelligence agencies broad access to personal data and reducing the requirements for warrants in the name of national security. 2. Counter policy. American Privacy Preservation Act, APA, 1. Policy proposal. Reinstate and strengthen privacy laws limiting government surveillance powers, including a digital privacy bill of rights that mandates judicial oversight before data collection and ensures that citizens have transparency and control over their digital information. APA would restore checks on law enforcement's access to personal data, reasserting Fourth Amendment protections. 3. Policy for control over elections and voter suppression. 1. Project 2025 policy implements stricter voter ID laws, voter roll purges, and limited polling hours, effectively disenfranchising marginalized communities and consolidating voting oversight under federal control. 2. Counter policy. National Fair Voting Act, NFVA, 1. Policy proposal. Introduce federal safeguards that protect voter access and counteract gerrymandering, ensuring uniform voting standards across all states. NFVA would mandate accessible polling locations, early voting periods, and support for mail-in voting to encourage broader participation. An independent voting commission could monitor and report on federal and state compliance, maintaining fair electoral practices. 4. Militarization of domestic law enforcement. 1. Project 2025 policy expands the use of military equipment and intelligence for domestic policing, effectively merging aspects of military and police functions and permitting a zero-tolerance policy on protests and civil disobedience. 2. Counter policy. Civilian Law Enforcement Integrity Act, CLEIA, 1. Policy proposal. Reinforce laws that separate military and police responsibilities, Posse Comitatus Act, ensuring that domestic law enforcement remains under civilian oversight. CLEIA would also restrict the flow of military-grade equipment to police forces, mandate training on de-escalation, and encourage community-based policing models that prioritize public safety over military tactics. 5. Control over educational content and censorship. 1. Project 2025 policy imposes federal mandates on school curriculums, focusing on patriotic content and banning specific historical perspectives that are seen as anti-American. 2. Counter policy. Academic Freedom and Integrity Act, AFIA, 1. Policy proposal. Establish clear, protected rights to academic freedom in public schools, safeguarding local control over curriculums and protecting teachers from political coercion. AFIA would ensure that curriculum development is led by educational experts and that students are taught comprehensive, factual histories and diverse perspectives. 6. Policy for weakening environmental protections. 1. Project 2025 policy rolls back environmental regulations, reduces restrictions on industrial emissions, and opens more public lands for resource extraction. Prioritizing economic growth over environmental sustainability. 2. Counter policy, Environmental Health and Resilience Act, EHRA. 1. Policy proposal. Reinforce and expand existing environmental protections under agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. EHRA would require impact assessments for industrial projects on public lands, stricter emissions limits, and public transparency for environmental decisions. The act would also promote renewable energy development to ensure long-term environmental health and energy independence. 7. Immigration restriction and deportation expansion. 1. Project 2025 policy implements strict, immediate deportation policies, builds additional barriers along the U.S. border, and limits paths to citizenship. 2. Counter policy, Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act, CIRA. 1. Policy proposal, reform immigration to balance national security with humane treatment of migrants. Establishing a path to citizenship for long-term residents, streamlined asylum processes, and clear legal standards for deportation that protect human rights. CIRA would include provisions for community-based support and integration services. 8. Restriction of reproductive rights and healthcare access. 1. Project 2025 policy bans abortion nationwide, restricts access to reproductive health services, and rolls back protections for contraceptive coverage. 2. Counter policy, Reproductive Freedom and Health Act, RFHA. 1. Policy proposal, protect healthcare autonomy, ensure access to reproductive health services, and expand healthcare education. RFHA would codify the right to choose into federal law and protect access to birth control, maternal care, and mental health services, prioritizing patient rights over political influence. 9. Suppression of LGBTQ+ rights and protections. 1. Project 2025 policy limits legal protections for LGBTQ+ individuals, including removal of anti-discrimination protections in employment, housing, and healthcare. 2. Counter policy, Equality and Non-Discrimination Act, ENDA. 1. Policy proposal, codify anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQ+ individuals in federal law, ensuring equal access to employment, housing, healthcare, and education. ENDA would establish strict penalties for violations and promote inclusivity through training and advocacy. 10. Limiting access to independent media and free speech. 1. Project 2025 policy imposes regulations on media outlets, increases fines on subversive content, and pressures platforms to censor anti-administration viewpoints. 2. Counter policy, Free Press Protection Act, FPPA. 1. Policy proposal, protect press freedom by reinforcing the First Amendment, creating penalties for government interference in media operations, and supporting independent journalism with grants and legal protections. FPPA would safeguard digital and print media from censorship and prioritize transparency in government media interactions. 11. Promotion of isolationist foreign policy and reduction of international cooperation. 1. Project 2025 policy reduces U.S. involvement in global alliances and trade agreements, promotes self-reliance, and decreases international aid, focusing solely on national interests. 2. Counter policy, Global Partnerships and Stability Act, GPSA. 1. Policy proposal, ensure that U.S. foreign policy remains engaged in global cooperation by recommitting to international alliances, e.g., NATO, UN, and trade agreements. GPSA would provide avenues for international cooperation, ensuring the U.S. remains a responsible global partner while strengthening national security through diplomacy. 12. Economic policies favoring large corporations over workers. 1. Project 2025 policy reduces regulations on corporations, lowers taxes on the wealthy, and limits worker protections, aiming to stimulate business growth at the expense of labor rights. 2. Counter policy, Workers' Rights and Fair Economy Act, WRFEA. 1. Policy proposal, reinstate and expand protections for workers, promote fair labor practices, and ensure livable wages. WRFEA would introduce progressive tax policies to distribute economic gains equitably, create incentives for small businesses, and hold corporations accountable for labor law violations. In this fictional analysis, countering Project 2025 would require multifaceted efforts across legal, social, and international arenas to protect democratic principles, ensure human rights, and sustain a healthy governance framework. Each antidote policy could be introduced to align with constitutional values, addressing the root concerns within these fictional policies and restoring the resilience of democratic institutions. This approach underscores the importance of transparency, equity, and civil liberties to fortify American democracy against concentrated authoritarian power.